The first thing Ethan Miller noticed was not that nobody chose her, it was that everyone had learned to enjoy not choosing her. The greenhouse of Ashfall Crossing glowed like a warm lie against the red dust beyond its glass walls. Outside, the colony wind dragged dry soil across the settlement in long, rust-colored sheets, scraping against the panels with a sound like fingernails on old bone. Inside, the air was humid, golden, and thick with the smell of wet leaves, nutrient mist, and heated metal from the irrigation pipes Ethan was supposed to be repairing. He lay half under a steam valve near the eastern wall, boots sticking out from behind a row of root trays, one hand wrapped around a wrench, the other braced against a pipe that had not been properly serviced since before the last harvest failed. The colony called it a greenhouse. Ethan called it a miracle with loose bolts. Above him, the seasonal choosing ceremony had already begun. He had tried not to listen. It was none of his business. That was what people told themselves when they wanted peace more than honesty. Still, sound traveled through pipes. Every small bell rang through the metal above his shoulder. Every polite cheer vibrated in the valve housing. Every family name announced by Matron Velka Rowe came through the irrigation line as a faint, cold echo. House Miros claims Liana Pell. A bell. Applause. House Thane claims Oriva Sol. Another bell. More applause. Ethan tightened the lower clamp and frowned as steam hissed near his wrist. The nozzle assembly was misaligned by maybe a quarter-inch. Enough to chill one row of seed trays and drown another. People loved blaming soil, weather, fate, bloodlines. Machines were usually less dramatic. They failed because someone ignored a warning light. A soft laugh passed through the greenhouse above him. Not happy laughter. The other kind. Ethan stopped turning the wrench. He knew that sound. He had heard it in school cafeterias, in hiring rooms, in colony ration lines, anywhere people realized the crowd would protect their cruelty if they dressed it like a joke. He slid out from beneath the pipe, shoulders scraping the metal frame, and sat up. The ceremony filled the central aisle. Alien families stood in layered farming robes dyed green, bronze, and cream, colors meant to honor fertility, rain, and lineage. Seed bowls rested on low tables. Children held ribboned water jars. Above the planting beds, mist drifted in soft clouds, catching the yellow lights and making everyone look kinder than they were. At the far end of the aisle stood Soraya Venn. She was the last woman in the line. That was the second thing Ethan noticed. Not her beauty. Not the unusual gray-green tone of her skin, cool and soft under the greenhouse light. Not her dark hair with a silver sheen braided simply down her back. Not the amber eyes lowered toward the floor but not fully surrendered to it. He noticed the space around her. People had given her distance the way settlers gave distance to cracked fuel cells. Quietly. Superstitiously. As if standing too close could transfer blame. She wore the same pale ceremony dress as the others, but hers had no embroidered family vine at the hem. No seed beads. No bright sash from a claiming house. Around her wrist was a strip of gray cloth tied too tightly, hiding something beneath. Her hands were folded inside her sleeves, but Ethan saw the right one tremble once before she pressed it still. Matron Velka stood before the gathered houses with a carved staff of black rootwood in one hand. She was tall, severe, and old enough that everyone treated her opinion like weather. Her skin was deep moss green, her eyes bright as polished brass. When she turned toward Soraya, her expression did not change. That made the cruelty feel official. Soraya Venn, Velka announced. Barren marked. Low household remnant. No verified fertility alliance. No land inheritance. No compatible claim petitions. The greenhouse grew quiet enough for Ethan to hear the broken valve drip behind him. One drop. Then another. Soraya did not look up. She did not shrink either. That was the third thing he noticed. The whole room expected her to become smaller, and she refused them that satisfaction by an inch. A young man near the seed tables whispered something Ethan did not catch. His friends did. They smiled into their sleeves. Matron Velka lifted the staff. Does any house claim Soraya Venn for the planting season? The silence that followed had weight. Not empty silence. Chosen silence. Every family had decided not to move, and the room made a ritual out of it. Ethan looked from face to face. Some avoided Soraya's direction. Some watched her with pity polished thin enough to become contempt. A few looked relieved, as if her rejection confirmed the wisdom of their own bloodlines. The greenhouse lights hummed. The mist system clicked. No bell rang. Soraya's eyes lowered to the seed tray beside her feet. A single seed had rolled from a bowl during the ceremony, small and dark against the damp soil. A cold jet from Ethan's faulty valve drifted toward it. Without drawing attention, Soraya shifted one foot and blocked the draft with the edge of her dress. Ethan saw it. Nobody else did. In a room that had just declared her useless to the season, she was protecting one seed from the cold. Something tightened in his chest, quiet and immediate. Matron Velka turned to the crowd. The silence of the houses confirms her standing. At dawn, she will be reassigned to the dry fields under non-house labor provision. A murmur passed through the families, not shocked, not troubled. Administrative mercy, their faces seemed to say. The dry fields lay beyond the colony windbreaks, where the soil had gone mineral-hard and red, where pumps failed faster than budgets allowed, where people without houses were sent to prove they were as useless as everyone claimed. Ethan had repaired enough equipment out there to know the difference between work and disposal. Soraya knew it too. Her mouth did not move, but he saw the knowledge settle behind her eyes. He set the wrench down. The metal hit the floor louder than he meant it to. Several heads turned. Velka's gaze found him near the pipe row, and irritation crossed her face at the sight of a human mechanic interrupting sacred humiliation with tool noise. "Technician Miller," she said, "the ceremony is not your concern." Ethan stood slowly, wiping his oil-stained hands on the thighs of his work pants. He was 35, white, sun-browned at the neck from exterior repairs, wearing a faded utility shirt under a patched brown jacket, and boots still dusted red from the morning fields. He had no house. No land. No ceremonial sash. Just a wrench, a bad knee, and a long memory for what it felt like to watch a room decide someone did not matter. "You asked if any house claims her?" he said. A few people laughed before they understood he was serious. Velka's eyes narrowed. "You are not a house." "No." Ethan stepped into the aisle. The greenhouse seemed to stretch as every conversation died. Soraya looked at him then, really looked, amber eyes sharp with warning more than hope. He read the warning clearly. "Do not make me a spectacle twice." He kept his voice even. "But if the question is whether someone is willing to stand with her, I will." The room went dead still. Then the laughter came, low and scattered, swelling as people realized the human had offered himself as a punchline. Velka did not laugh. "Do you understand what you are taking?" Ethan glanced at Soraya, at the cloth around her wrist, at the seed she still shielded from the broken valve, at the dry field sentence hanging in the wet greenhouse air. "A person," he said. "That seems to be the part you keep missing." The laughter faded. Soraya's hand stopped trembling. And somewhere behind Ethan, the damaged irrigation valve released one final hiss, sending a thin warm mist over the seed at her feet. The greenhouse did not know how to breathe after Ethan Miller spoke. A few seconds earlier, the room had been full of soft cruelty, the kind that wore ceremonial robes and called itself tradition. Now the mist hung motionless in the golden lights, the seed trays glistened in damp rows, and every alien family in Ashfall Crossing stared at the human mechanic as if a pipe had started praying. Ethan stood in the central aisle with valve oil on his hands and red dust on his boots, feeling the weight of every eye but not moving away from it. He had spent most of his adult life under broken machines, under tractors, under irrigation tanks, under the kind of equipment people only noticed when it failed. He knew what it meant to be below everyone's line of sight. Maybe that was why he had seen Soraya then clearly. Matron Velka held her black rootwood staff so tightly that the carved rings along it clicked against her fingers. "You do not understand our custom," she said. Her voice remained calm, but the warmth had gone out of it. This is not a market accident or a human contract dispute. This is a planting bond. A house matter. Ethan glanced at the families standing behind her, their embroidered robes, their seed bowls, their hands clean because other people repaired the pipes that fed their roots. Then I have a question. Velka's eyes narrowed. You have already spoken out of turn. I do that when the turn is built wrong. Someone near the back made a soft sound of outrage. Ethan ignored it and looked at Soraya. She had not moved from the end of the line. The warm mist from the faulty valve had settled on her gray-green skin, catching in tiny beads along her cheek and the dark silver sheen of her braid. Her amber eyes were fixed on him now, not grateful, not trusting, only intensely alert. She looked like a person watching an unstable bridge and calculating whether crossing it was worse than staying behind. Ethan lowered his voice, but the greenhouse carried it anyway. Can she say no? No one answered. That silence told him enough. It was different from the first silence. The first had been rejection. This one was machinery seizing because someone had inserted the wrong tool. Ethan turned back to Velka. That seems important. Velka lifted her chin. The ceremony exists to place unbound individuals within viable households for the survival of the colony. That was not the question. Human language oversimplifies. Human language does fine with yes and no. The families shifted. Above them, moisture gathered on the glass ceiling and slid down in silver threads. Outside, a gust of red dust struck the greenhouse wall hard enough to rattle the support ribs. The colony was always being reminded that the world beyond the glass wanted it dead. That should have made them kinder. Somehow it had made them better at measuring worth. Velka turned toward Soraya at last. Soraya, then, under seasonal law, if you reject a claim offered in open ceremony, you accept dry field reassignment without appeal. The words were clean. The meaning was not. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. That is not consent. That is a trap with nicer flooring. Velka's gaze snapped back to him. You presume much for a man with no land. I repair the machines that keep yours wet. A low murmur passed through the workers along the greenhouse edge. Ethan heard it. Velka did too. Her mouth flattened. Soraya took one careful step forward. The fabric at her wrist shifted, and the cloth hiding her mark flashed faint green beneath it, so brief Ethan wondered if he had imagined it. If I say no, she said, her voice quiet but steady, I go to the dry fields alone. Ethan faced her fully. Yes. If I say yes, I become your household obligation. He hated the phrase. Household obligation. As if the person had been removed and only accounting remained. Not to me. The law will say otherwise. The law can be wrong in writing. Her eyes searched his face. There was no softness in that search. Only survival looking for a hidden hook. Why would you take on a sentence meant for me? Ethan looked down at his hands, at the oil under his fingernails, at the small burns from years of bad wiring and hot pipes. He thought of his container workshop on the edge of the settlement, the narrow bed beside the tool wall, the old coffee maker that made everything taste like regret, the stack of unpaid repair tickets from families who always promised after harvest. He thought of dry fields beyond the windbreaks, where pumps went to die and people were sent when society wanted disposal to look like duty. Because they were about to throw you away in public, he said. And everyone was pretending that made it clean. Soraya's expression changed by the smallest amount. Not belief. Something before belief. A door unlocking somewhere far inside but not yet opening. Velka struck the base of her staff once against the greenhouse floor. The sound cracked through the mist. Enough. The human claim is irregular. The council will review it after the ceremony. No private review, Ethan said. This happened in front of witnesses. You do not dictate process. I am not dictating. I am asking in the same room where you asked if anyone would claim her. He looked at Soraya again. If you want me gone, say it. I will walk out and find another way to make noise. If you want a way out of that dry field sentence, I can be that too. But I am not here to own you. The words moved through the greenhouse slowly, like water reaching dry soil. Soraya looked at him for a long time. The families waited for her to refuse, or submit, or collapse into the role they had written for her. She did none of those things. She looked past Ethan toward the side tables where discarded seeds sat in cracked bowls, the ones considered too weak for family plots. Then she looked at the floor near her feet, where the little seed she had shielded now glistened under the warm mist. If I leave with you, she said, they lose the right to send me alone. Ethan nodded. Then let us make them lose something. A gasp broke from one of the older women near the seed bowls. Velka's face went still. Stillness, Ethan had learned, was where powerful people put rage when rage would make them look common. Soraya stepped out of the line. No bell rang. No applause followed. Her movement was small, only 2 steps, but the whole greenhouse felt it. She came to stand beside Ethan, leaving an empty space at the end of the row where shame had been assigned to stand. Velka turned toward the civic registrar, a thin alien with trembling hands and a tablet clutched to his chest. Record the irregular human claim, she said. The registrar swallowed. Under what status, matron? Velka's eyes remained on Ethan. Trial household. Dry field placement. 1 season. The murmurs sharpened. Even some of the families understood the cruelty of that. Velka continued, voice smooth again. If Technician Miller believes his compassion can substitute for land, water, and lineage, the colony will permit proof. He and Soraya Ven will take the eastern dry fields at dawn. If they produce a viable crop before the inspection moon, the bond will be recognized. If not, the reassignment stands, and the human forfeits claim interference rights. Ethan let out a breath through his nose. Garbage disposal with paperwork. Soraya glanced at him. What? Nothing. Human legal term. It was not. But it almost made her mouth move. Almost. Velka stepped closer, lowering her voice so only they could hear, though the greenhouse had become so silent that privacy was mostly theater. You think kindness changes soil, human? Ethan looked through the glass at the red dust outside, at the world that had already taken too much from people who thought survival required hardness. No, he said. But I know neglect kills it. Velka's eyes shifted to Soraya's covered wrist for one brief second. Too brief for most. Ethan saw it. Soraya felt it. Her hand closed over the cloth. Whatever Velka knew, she did not want named in the greenhouse. That was the 4th thing Ethan noticed. The ceremony ended without bells for Soraya. The families resumed their careful noise, too eager to pretend nothing permanent had happened. People moved around Ethan and Soraya as if they were already halfway exiled, which, by dawn, they would be. Ethan returned to the broken irrigation pipe long enough to shut the valve properly. He picked up the small seed from the floor and placed it in one of the empty trays near the warm mist. Soraya watched him. That seed is defective, she said. Maybe. It will not grow. Ethan tightened the repaired clamp, then looked at her. A lot of people said that today. Outside, red dust scraped the glass. Inside, for the first time, Soraya Ven looked at the human not as a rescuer, not as an owner, not as another hand reaching for power over her life, but as a strange man with dirty hands who had asked the one question her world forgot to build into its laws. Can she say no? At dawn, they would be sent to land everyone had already declared dead. But under the tray where Ethan placed the discarded seed, the soil held 1 drop of warm water and did not let it go. The eastern dry fields began 5 miles beyond the last greenhouse wall, where Ashfall Crossing stopped pretending the planet could be tamed. Ethan Miller drove the old utility rover through red morning dust with one hand on the wheel, and the other holding the dash panel in place whenever the road shook too hard. The vehicle had once belonged to the irrigation department before someone decided it was cheaper to call it obsolete than repair the suspension. Ethan had repaired it anyway, mostly out of spite. Behind them, the settlement shrank into a cluster of silver domes and yellow greenhouse glass, warm-looking from a distance, kinder than it had any right to appear. Soraya Van sat beside him in silence, her hands folded around a small cloth bag of discarded seeds. She had changed out of the ceremony dress into a plain field wrap and a faded gray coat that someone from the storage office had thrown at her, as if usefulness could be delivered without respect. The cloth around her wrist remained tied tight. Her amber eyes stayed on the land ahead, not on Ethan, not on the settlement, not on the dust curling behind them like something erasing tracks. In the cargo bed, Ethan had packed everything the council allowed them to take: 2 cracked water drums, a coil of copper line, 3 filter cartridges past their official expiration date, a portable welder, a box of hand tools, a packet of nutrient tablets, and 6 seed bags marked non-viable. The label bothered him more than it should have. Non-viable was one of those words people used when they wanted failure to sound scientific. He glanced at Soraya's bag. They gave you the rejected seeds? Yes. Of course they did. They were scheduled for disposal. That word keeps showing up around you. She looked at him then, sideways and sharp. You speak as if you are offended on behalf of seeds. I fix farm machines. Offended on behalf of seeds is basically the job. She studied him for a moment, trying to decide whether he was joking, foolish, or both. The rover jolted over a dry wash, and the water drums thumped in the back. Ahead, the dry fields spread out under a pale sky, wide and red and hard as old ceramic. Windbreak posts leaned at uneven angles. Half-buried irrigation ribs crossed the soil like bones. The old pump house stood near the center, a low metal structure with a collapsed side awning and dust packed into every seam. Beyond it, miles of unused plots stretched toward the dark ridge where the inspection moon would rise in 3 weeks. Ethan slowed the rover. No birds. No insects. No shimmer of moisture over the ground. Just wind dragging grit across dead furrows. Charming, he said. They call this a trial field. Soraya replied. Trial means someone believes success is possible. Maybe they are bad at vocabulary. No. They are very good at it. He parked beside the pump house. When he opened the door, heat struck him immediately, dry and flat, nothing like the humid greenhouse air. The dust tasted metallic. It got into his teeth before he had both boots on the ground. Soraya stepped out more slowly, one hand on the seed bag, the other near the wrapped mark on her wrist. The wind pulled at her coat and dark silver hair. She stood facing the dead field with a stillness that was not fear exactly. Recognition, maybe? You have been here before, Ethan said. Once. For work? For punishment review. He stopped unloading the toolbox. The phrase did not ask for pity. That made it worse. Sorry. She turned to him. You did not send me. Still sorry. That answer seemed to trouble her. She looked away and walked toward the first row of old irrigation stakes. Ethan watched the soil crack under her boots. At the pump house, he pried open the service panel and found exactly what he expected from a place the council wanted to fail: a clogged intake filter, a seized pressure regulator, 2 bypasses installed wrong, and a control board protected from dust by what appeared to be optimism and a dead spider. He set his tool bag down. Well, the good news is this pump did not die naturally. Soraya crouched near the first furrow and let some soil run through her fingers. What does that mean? Means it was neglected with enthusiasm. Can you repair it? Ethan leaned into the panel. Maybe. If the motor windings are not cooked and if your council did not strip the spare parts. They would have. Then I will become emotionally attached to scrap metal. He worked until the morning heat climbed and sweat cut clean tracks through the dust on his neck. He replaced the filter with one of the expired cartridges, flushed grit from the intake line, and used copper wire to bridge a sensor whose only remaining function was complaining. Soraya moved down the rows, placing seeds into tiny holes she made with 2 fingers, covering each with the same care a person might use to tuck in a sleeping child. The gesture was too gentle for the land they had been given. Ethan noticed that she planted even the cracked seeds. Even the gray ones? Even the small shriveled ones he would have assumed were dead. You think those will grow? he asked after the third hour. She did not look up. No, but you are planting them. Yes. That is either faith or stubbornness. It is respect. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve and said nothing. The words settled over the field with more weight than rain. By late afternoon, the pump coughed once, shook the shed hard enough to drop dust from the ceiling, then produced a thin brown stream into the test line. Ethan whooped before he could stop himself. The sound bounced across the empty fields and came back smaller. Soraya looked up, startled. It is not clean water. No, but it is moving water. Moving is the first miracle. The pump sputtered again. The line cleared from brown to cloudy gray. He connected the first irrigation rib and opened the valve carefully. A weak mist hissed across the nearest row, barely enough to darken the soil, but the smell that rose from it was immediate: hot dust, minerals, old roots, and something underneath that had not fully died. Soraya froze. Ethan saw her hand fly to her wrapped wrist. Beneath the cloth, a green light pulsed once. She turned away quickly, but the field had already answered. The soil around the nearest seed trembled. Not much. Just a small shiver, like a breath under a blanket. Ethan stared. Soraya saw him staring and closed her hand over the mark. You should not have seen that. He let the pump run, eyes moving from the darkened soil to her face. Did that hurt? The question stopped her as surely as if he had stepped in front of her. She looked almost angry for a second, then lost the anger because it did not know where to land. What? Your wrist. The light. Did it hurt? The wind moved through the dead rows. Far behind them, the pump clicked and hissed with stubborn life. Soraya's fingers loosened slightly over the cloth. No good. That is what you ask? Should I ask something else? Most would ask what it does. I figured you would tell me if you wanted. Most would ask what it is worth. Ethan looked around the dry fields, at the repaired pump struggling against years of neglect, at the seeds she had planted despite not believing they would grow, at the woman everyone had called barren, while she knelt in dead soil like it could still hear kindness. I am bad at pricing people, he said. Soraya looked down at the furrow. The green light beneath her cloth pulsed again, softer this time, no longer hidden fast enough. They called it a barren mark, she whispered. Since I was a child. Is it? No. The answer came out so quietly the wind nearly took it. Ethan turned the valve lower so the mist would not drown the row. Then what is it? Soraya knelt beside the damp soil, pressed her marked wrist gently to the ground through the cloth, and sang one note under her breath. It was not loud. It was barely music. More like a vibration her body remembered before language. The soil darkened around her hand. A hair-thin green shoot pushed up from the red dust, trembled in the weak mist, and unfolded two tiny leaves toward the failing sun. Ethan did not speak. Some moments punished words. Soraya pulled her hand back as if she had done something forbidden, her eyes wide, breath unsteady. You cannot tell them. Velka knows, Ethan said. Her silence answered. The little sprout stood between them, absurdly small in the dead field, and somehow braver than everyone in the greenhouse. Ethan crouched beside it, careful not to cast too much shadow. They did not send you here because you are useless. Soraya's face tightened. No, they sent you here because they were afraid you might not be. She looked at him then, and for the first time since the ceremony, fear and hope arrived in the same breath. Behind them, the old pump kept working, badly, unevenly, beautifully. Ahead, the dry field stretched for miles, still red, still harsh, still almost dead. But not entirely. Not anymore. The first night in the dry fields arrived without darkness at first. It came as a color change, the pale sky dimming into copper then bruised purple, while the red dust kept moving under the wind like the planet refused to sleep. Ethan Miller rigged 2 flood lamps to the pump house roof, both running on a battery pack that had seen better colonies, better owners, and probably better decisions. One lamp flickered every few seconds. The other made a high whining sound that set his teeth on edge. He left them both on. Out here, imperfect light was still light. The old pump worked in short, stubborn breaths, drawing cloudy water through the repaired filter and pushing it into the first 3 irrigation ribs. The mist was weak, but it touched the soil. That mattered. Soraya Ven moved between the rows with a cloth wrapped tighter around her glowing wrist, checking each planted seed by touch. She did not sing again. Not while Ethan could hear. Not after the single green shoot had pushed through the red dust and changed the entire shape of what they were afraid of. Ethan pretended to busy himself with the pressure gauge so she would not have to feel watched. He knew what privacy looked like when a person had been denied it too long. The dry field station had a shelter, technically. For metal walls, 1 slanted roof, 2 bunks, a heater that smelled like burnt wire, and a table bolted to the floor because the wind had opinions about furniture. Ethan set his tool bag on the table and found a stack of old field reports inside a cracked drawer. He flipped through them while Soraya stood near the doorway, looking out at the small misted row where the sprouts stood under the lamp. Most pages were identical. Pump failure. Soil failure. Seed failure. Worker failure. Recommendation: reduce water allocation. He stopped at the last line and read it twice. Worker failure. He looked up. They blamed the people sent here. Soraya did not turn. They always did. For broken pumps? For not making broken things obey. Ethan tossed the reports onto the table. The papers slid apart with a dry whisper. That is convenient. Convenience is the language of councils. She finally stepped inside, bringing dust and cold air with her. The gray field coat hung loose on her shoulders. Without the greenhouse lights, her skin looked darker, green-gray under the lamp, silver along the cheekbones when she turned. Her amber eyes seemed brighter in the rough shelter, not softer, just less surrounded by people trying to dim them. Ethan opened one of the ration boxes. Protein bars, mineral packets, 2 sealed breads hard enough to threaten dental work, and tea leaves labeled calming blend by someone with a cruel sense of humor. He handed her one of the softer bars. She looked at it before taking it. Is this another human habit? Eating? Handing food to someone without saying what it costs? Yes. Very suspicious. We practice it in secret. She looked almost amused, then sat at the table, holding the ration between both hands. For a while, they ate in the hum of the bad heater and the distant hiss of the pump. Outside, the wind moved over the dry fields in long, low waves. The single sprout cast a tiny shadow under the flood lamp. It should not have looked important. It did anyway. Soraya broke the silence first. The seed singers were not myths. Ethan chewed slowly and waited. She stared at the ration wrapper as if the words might be written there. Before the houses owned water, before marriage bonds became land contracts, the first growers used song to measure soil life. Not magic. Not the way children tell it. Resonance. Breath. Mineral response. Microbial awakening. The singers could feel whether ground was sleeping, poisoned, dry, or merely waiting. Ethan nodded toward the field. And your mark? She uncovered her wrist slowly. The cloth fell away, revealing a pale green pattern under the skin, branching like roots around her pulse point. The light was faint now, but steady. They told me it meant my body was empty. Barren marked. Unsuitable for family sea lions. I believed them for years because everyone else did. Who told you the truth? Her fingers tightened around the cloth. My grandmother. Once. When I was 9. She covered the windows before she said the word seed singer. She told me never to sing near planted soil, never to let the mark glow, never to let Velka see it wake. 2 weeks later, she was reassigned to the outer compost crews. She did not come back. Ethan looked at the field reports again, at all those clean little failures written by clean little hands. Velka knew. Yes. Why not use you? If you can help the land, why hide you? Soraya looked up then, and the answer in her face was older than anger. Because if dead fields can live without house permission, then land stops being a leash. The heater clicked. The wind pressed against the shelter wall. Ethan let the words sit until they found their full weight. He had spent years repairing equipment for families that owned water rights, seed rights, greenhouse time, and access to shade. He had thought it was greed, plain and ugly. But this was deeper. This was a system built to make scarcity sacred. So they called you useless, he said. Because useful would have made you dangerous. Soraya covered the mark again, but not as quickly this time. I am not what the old singers were. I know only fragments. A few tones. The names of minerals. My grandmother's hand-tapping rhythm on the table when she thought no one could hear. One sprout does not make a field. Ethan leaned back, the chair creaking under him. No. But one sprout proves the field is not dead. She looked toward the open doorway. That may be worse. Usually is. If Velka learns it grew, she will come before the inspection moon. Then we make sure she has something worth seeing. You think machines and songs can undo years of poisoned soil in 3 weeks? Ethan glanced at the pump gauge through the doorway, watching the pressure needle wobble just above the minimum line. I think machines and songs can do more than people who already decided to fail. Soraya studied him. You speak like a person who has lost land. The words hit close enough that he looked away. On the far wall of the shelter, someone had scratched tally marks into the metal, seasons counted by people who had slept here before being moved, forgotten, or worn down. My family had a settlement plot on Corrigan's moon, he said after a while. Not much. 40 acres under a dome, 2 greenhouses, 1 stubborn apple tree my mother treated like a family member. Then came a dry cycle, a pump recall, bad filters, delayed shipments. By the time help arrived, the apple tree was a stick and my father had stopped talking about next season. Soraya listened without interrupting. That was her kindness, he thought. Not soft words. Space. I learned to fix things because everything that mattered kept breaking, Ethan said. And because I hated the look people got when someone in a clean office told them nothing more could be done. Outside, the pump stuttered. Ethan stood immediately, grabbed a wrench, and stepped into the night. Soraya followed, ration half finished in one hand. The pressure gauge had dipped. He opened the side panel, adjusted the copper bypass, and tapped the regulator with the handle of the wrench. The pump steadied. That cannot be a standard repair method, Soraya said. It is more common than engineers admit. She looked at the mist line, then at the single sprout. The tiny leaves trembled under the weak spray. Soraya knelt beside it, not touching, only humming one low note deep in her throat. The soil around the sprout darkened by another inch. Ethan crouched several feet away, careful, quiet. Still no pain? She shook her head. Fear, mostly. That one is harder to calibrate. Can humans repair that too? He looked at her, then at the dead fields stretching beyond the lamps, waiting under red dust and old lies. Sometimes. Badly. With food, patience, and questions no one else bothered to ask. Soraya's mouth curved, very slightly. The mark on her wrist pulsed once beneath the cloth, and in the next row, another seed stirred. Not sprouted. Not yet. Just moved, lifting the soil by a grain. Ethan saw it. Soraya saw it. Neither spoke. The wind kept moving. The pump kept breathing. Above the dry fields, the inspection moon rose pale and distant, 3 weeks away by orbit but already watching. In the thin pool of lamplight, a human mechanic and an unwanted alien woman knelt beside 2 impossible signs of life, and the dead land, for the first time in years, seemed to be listening. By the 4th day, the dry fields had become a workshop with roots. Ethan Miller had taken apart half the pump house, rebuilt the intake screen from scrap mesh, rerouted the broken irrigation ribs with copper line, and convinced 2 ancient moisture collectors on the ridge to cough up water they had been pretending not to have. The system was ugly, loud, and held together with clamps, wire, and insults directed at several generations of colony engineers. It worked. Not well. Not enough. But every hour, a thin mist crossed the first rows and darkened the red soil in uneven patches. Soraya then walked those rows at dawn and dusk, humming notes too low for Ethan to separate from the wind. She never sang long. She always stopped before the mark on her wrist grew too bright. Still, the field changed. It did not turn green in a miracle burst the way old stories would have liked. It changed like a wounded thing deciding whether to trust hands again. One sprout became 7. 7 became a thin scatter of pale shoots, each no taller than Ethan's thumb, each bending toward the weak morning light with ridiculous courage. Ethan marked them with bits of white wire so he would not step on them during repairs. Soraya pretended not to notice. He noticed her noticing. That became most of their conversations. Small things given without ceremony. A cup of heated ration tea left near her row. A shade cloth fixed over the first seedlings. A pressure gauge turned so she could read it without asking. At night, they ate at the bolted table in the shelter while the pump breathed outside and the wind combed dust against the walls. Soraya spoke more now, but only in pieces. Her grandmother's kitchen. The old tapping rhythms hidden in chores. The way the houses renamed fear as science and cruelty as fertility law. Ethan spoke in pieces too. Corrigan's moon. His mother's apple tree. The first machine he fixed, a greenhouse fan he had no right to understand but refused to let die. Either of them said trust. They built it badly and let it stand. On the 5th morning, the colony drone arrived. It came low over the ridge, a silver inspection unit with Matron Velka's crest painted beneath its lens. Ethan heard the buzz first and looked up from the water manifold. Soraya was in the field, one hand hovering over the seedlings, wrist faintly glowing under the loosened cloth. She snatched it back and stood. The drone circled once, close enough to stir dust across the young shoots. Ethan stepped between it and the row before thinking. That thing belongs to Velka? Soraya's face closed. Yes. Friendly visit? No. The drone projected Velka's image into the air above the pump house. The matron appeared from the shoulders up, robed in dark green, calm as a sealed door. Technician Miller? Soraya Ven. Interim observation shows unauthorized modification of irrigation infrastructure and misuse of colony water reserve. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. The pump was broken. The pump was assigned limited function. That is what people call broken when they do not plan to fix it. Velka's projected eyes moved to the rows behind him. You were placed here to demonstrate viability under council conditions, not to alter field parameters. Soraya stepped forward. You gave us dead machines and dead seeds. And yet you requested a trial by accepting the human claim. The image turned slightly toward Ethan. Compassion does not exempt you from law. Ethan looked at the little sprouts trembling in the drone wash. No. But law should be embarrassed when compassion is the only thing making food grow. Velka's expression did not change, but the drone dipped lower. The council will conduct early inspection tomorrow. If the field is deemed non-compliant, the trial ends. Soraya returns to reassignment. You, Technician Miller, will lose colony repair privileges for interference with agricultural governance. The projection vanished. The drone rose and sped back toward the settlement, leaving the field quieter than before. Soraya did not move until it disappeared beyond the ridge. Then she knelt beside one of the disturbed seedlings and brushed dust gently from its leaves. Ethan crouched near the manifold, feeling anger press against his teeth. Early inspection. Of course. She saw the sprouts. Then she knows it is working. She knows it must not be allowed to work. Soraya's fingers trembled over the leaves. This time she did not hide it quickly enough. If they call it non-compliant, they can cut the water. Ethan looked at the pump, the patched lines, the water drums nearly empty, the sky too dry to forgive anyone. Then we need rain. Soraya looked at him like he had suggested moving the moon by hand. The atmospheric towers do not serve dry fields. They can. The council locked them. Councils love locking things they do not understand. He stood and walked to the ridge-facing side of the pump house, where the old condensation mast leaned 10 degrees west and pointed its cracked collection panels toward a sky that still held more moisture than the ground. This colony uses fog capture at night, right? Pulls water from upper winds, routes it to greenhouse reservoirs. Only for house fields. Not what I asked? She came beside him, following his gaze. Yes. The dry fields were connected once? Before the ration reforms. That phrase is doing a lot of dirty work. Ethan opened the mast's base panel and found ancient routing codes under dust, half the labels worn off but still readable enough to make him smile. There you are. Soraya looked inside. Can you reconnect it? Not alone. She understood before he said the rest. Her hand moved to her wrist. You want me to sing to the field before it has enough water? No. I want you to tell me what the field needs. I will find the pipes. You find the pulse. Fear crossed her face. If Velka sees the mark fully wake tomorrow, she will name me dangerous. She already named you worthless. Her naming privileges are suspect. Ethan. I know. He softened. The wind tugged red dust between them. I am not asking you to prove anything to her. I am asking what you want. That question, again, did what no command could. Soraya looked at the rows, at the seedlings marked by bits of white wire, at the dead miles beyond them. I want the field to answer where they can hear it. Then they worked. All day they worked. Ethan climbed the mast, replaced 2 cracked contacts, patched an old diversion valve, and ran new line from the condensation reservoir to the irrigation ribs. Soraya moved through the field with a bowl of damp soil, humming over it, listening with her fingers, telling him where mineral salts had poisoned the row and where old root networks still slept under the dust. By sunset, the sky over the ridge had thickened with a faint silver haze. Not clouds. Not yet. A possibility. Ethan stood on the pump house roof, sweat and dust turning his shirt stiff, and opened the atmospheric bypass. The mast groaned. The irrigation ribs clicked. Nothing happened. He cursed under his breath. Soraya stepped into the center row and unwrapped her wrist. The green mark bloomed brighter than he had ever seen, tracing lines up her forearm like vines made of light. She placed both hands over the soil and began to sing. This time, it was not one note. It was a low, layered sound, strange and aching, carrying rhythm like water moving through hidden roots. The field listened. Ethan felt it through the roof before he saw it. A vibration rose from the ground, passed through the pump house, and climbed into the mast. The silver haze above the ridge folded inward. The first drop hit Ethan's cheek. He froze. Another drop struck the roof. Then another. Below him, Soraya sang with her face lifted to the darkening sky, and the dry fields received the first artificial rain they had tasted in years. It was not a storm. It was not enough to save everything. But it was rain. Ethan laughed once, breathless and disbelieving, while water dotted the red dust around his boots. In the field below, the tiny seedlings lifted their leaves as if they had been waiting for her name all along. The rain lasted 12 minutes. Ethan Miller timed it because mechanics trusted numbers when wonder became too large to hold with both hands. 12 minutes of soft artificial rain falling over the eastern dry fields, not hard enough to flood the furrows, not steady enough to call a season saved, but real enough to darken the red dust into brown streaks that smelled of minerals, old roots, and something like memory waking underground. When the last drops faded into mist, the night became very quiet. Even the wind seemed unsure whether it had permission to move. Soraya Venn stood in the center row with her hands lowered and her wrist marks still glowing through the rainwater on her skin. The green light traced up her forearm in delicate branching lines, then slowly dimmed, leaving her trembling in the dark like a lamp after the power cuts. Ethan climbed down from the pump house roof too fast, slipped on the wet ladder rung, caught himself with one elbow, and landed badly enough to make his bad knee complain in several languages. He ignored it and crossed the field toward her. Soraya. She turned her head, but her eyes were unfocused, fixed somewhere below the soil or beyond it. The song had taken something out of her. Not blood. Not strength exactly. Distance. As if part of her had gone down with the water to speak with things that did not use words and had not fully returned yet. Ethan slowed before reaching her. Did it hurt? Her mouth moved once before sound came. No. He waited. The pump clicked behind them. Water ran in thin silver lines along the irrigation ribs. A sprout near her feet unfolded another leaf in the weak lamplight. Finally, she said. It listened. Ethan looked around at the rows. The field had not become green. Not yet. But everywhere the rain had touched, the soil seemed less dead. Little ridges had softened. Cracks had darkened. Seeds that had lain like stones now made tiny raised points beneath the surface. It was not a miracle that solved everything. It was worse for Velka than that. It was evidence. Then tomorrow is going to be loud, Ethan said. Soraya wrapped the cloth around her wrist with slower hands. Tomorrow she will call it contamination. Probably. She will say you altered the equipment illegally. I did. She will say I manipulated a trial field with forbidden biology. Did you? Soraya looked at the rose, and the faintest sadness touched her face. I sang to soil that was thirsty. Ethan nodded. Then we should write that down before someone with a title improves the sentence. They spent the rest of the night preparing not for harvest, but for witnesses. Ethan repaired the field recorder mounted on the pump house, a cracked black box that had once logged water flow, soil humidity, wind speed, and chemical balance before neglect turned it into a decorative complaint. He replaced the power cell with one from the rover, cleaned the lens with the inside of his shirt, and coaxed the old sensor array into recording a continuous feed of the rows. Soraya collected soil samples from each section, labeling them in careful script, her handwriting steady even when her shoulders were not. The rainwater left marks on her field wrap. Her hair had come loose from its braid, dark strands silvered by droplets and lamplight. She looked exhausted, but different. Less like someone waiting to be judged. More like someone preparing to answer. At dawn, the first real green line appeared across row 3. It began with the sprout from the first night, then 7 more, then a faint uneven thread where the old irrigation rib had leaked too long in one place. Ethan stood with a cup of rationed coffee in one hand and stared until steam stopped rising from it. That is a row, he said. Soraya came beside him. A poor one. A living one. She looked at him, and this time she did not correct the hope in his voice. By mid-morning, the council arrived in 3 polished rovers that had never carried tools, only authority. Matron Velka stepped out first, her dark green robes sealed against the dust, black rootwood staff in one hand, face composed for witnesses. Behind her came 2 agricultural assessors, a civic registrar, 3 house representatives, and a few younger workers who had clearly come because curiosity had outrun caution. More settlers gathered at the ridge line, not invited, not stopped. Dry fields did not usually attract crowds. Failure was not entertaining when it happened too often. Ethan stood near the pump controls with his sleeves rolled up and mud drying on his boots. Soraya stood in the first row, wrist covered, chin level. The field between them held dozens of small green shoots, fragile and undeniable. Velka's eyes moved over them once. Only once. Then she looked at the pump house. Unauthorized atmospheric diversion, she said. Ethan lifted the field recorder. Documented repair sequence. Misuse of council water. Recovered condensation from dry field infrastructure. Non-compliant seed activation. Soraya answered before Ethan could. Non-viable seed recovery. Velka's gaze turned to her. You have grown bold in exile. Soraya touched one small leaf with 2 fingers. No. I have grown something else. A murmur moved along the ridge line. Velka heard it, and smiled faintly, the way she had in the greenhouse before every cruelty became official. A handful of sprouts does not overturn colony law. Trial household requires a viable crop. This is a sentimental display created through irregular methods. Ethan walked to the recorder stand and activated the projection. Above the pump house, the night feed appeared, the broken pump, the repair logs, water levels, soil response, the time-stamped rain capture, Soraya's song rendered not as mysticism but as vibrational data interacting with mineral and microbial readings. The assessors leaned forward despite themselves. Numbers had a way of embarrassing prejudice. The field responded, one assessor said softly. Velka cut him a look. The field was interfered with. Ethan set the recorder down. That is agriculture. A few workers at the ridge laughed before catching themselves. Soraya stepped forward. You called me barren marked. Velka's face hardened. That is your classification. No, Soraya said. She untied the cloth from her wrist. The green mark shone in the morning light, not hidden now, not flaring in panic, but open and steady. A ripple passed through the gathered crowd. Some stepped back. Others stepped closer. This mark is older than your classification. Older than the house seed laws. Older than the ration reforms that cut the dry fields from the water lines. Velka's voice lowered. Cover that. Ethan heard the fear under the command. So did half the ridge. Soraya did not cover it. My grandmother called us seed singers. You called us defects because a field that listens to us does not need permission from your house to live. The words hit the crowd harder than the rain had hit the soil. The younger workers looked at one another. One of the House representatives went pale beneath his bronze skin. The assessors looked back at the data, then at Soraya's wrist, then at the green shoots. Velka lifted her staff. Myths are not evidence. Soraya nodded. Then use your evidence. She pointed to the soil trays. Test the microbial rise. Test the mineral shift. Test the water retention after the song. Test the non-viable seeds you marked for disposal. If the field is lying, your instruments will say so. For the first time, Velka had no immediate sentence ready. That silence was small. It was also new. The assessors began testing before she could forbid it without looking afraid. They knelt in the rows with probes and tablets, murmuring readings back and forth. Moisture retention increased. Dormant microbial colonies active. Seed viability reclassified. Trace resonance patterns present in soil structure. Each phrase made the ridge crowd less quiet. Ethan watched Soraya hear the results. Her face did not change much, but her fingers relaxed at her side. For a person who had spent her life being defined by one false word, hearing instruments refuse that word was its own kind of mercy. Velka stepped closer to Ethan while the assessors worked. You have no idea what you are encouraging. Ethan looked out across the dry fields, at the rows beginning to wake, at the workers leaning over the ridge, at the children staring at green like it was a story made visible. Food? Velka's eyes sharpened. Disorder. Funny how often those get confused when hungry people start growing things. Soraya heard him and turned. Their eyes met across the field. No big smile. No dramatic gesture. Just a shared understanding passing between a human mechanic and an alien woman everyone had tried to discard. They had not saved the fields yet. They had only made the lie harder to water. The final test result chimed from the lead assessor's tablet. His voice shook as he read it aloud. Eastern Dry Field Section 1 is biologically active. Growth potential confirmed. The crowd went silent. Then, somewhere at the ridge line, a child whispered, It is alive! That was all it took. The words moved from person to person, not as a cheer, but as recognition. It is alive. It is alive. It is alive. Velka stood rigid, the morning wind pulling at her robes. Soraya knelt and pressed her glowing wrist gently to the damp soil. This time, she did not hide the light. Ethan stood by the pump, one hand resting on the control lever, feeling the machine breathe under his palm. The dry field stretched beyond them, still mostly red, still wounded, still needing water, work, and time. But the first section had answered. And once a dead field answered in public, nobody could honestly call it dead again. The crowd did not leave after the assessor said the field was alive. That was what unsettled Matron Velka most. People at Ashfall Crossing were trained to return to their rows, their domes, their ration schedules, their assigned greenhouse lanes. They were not trained to stand at the edge of a dry field and stare at green shoots as if the ground had spoken back. But they stayed. Workers from the ridge crouched near the first row, careful not to touch. Children leaned around their parents to see the tiny leaves. The agricultural assessors kept running tests because their instruments, like honest machines, refused to respect politics. Moisture retention held. Microbial response climbed. Dormant seed viability improved. Each result appeared on the portable display in clean blue numbers, and each number made Velka look more like someone watching a locked door open from the wrong side. Ethan Miller stood beside the pump house with one hand on the control lever, mud drying on his boots, shirt stuck to his back, trying not to grin like an idiot in front of an entire council delegation. He failed a little. Soraya Van remained kneeling in the first row, her glowing wrist resting just above the damp soil. She was not singing now. She did not need to. The field was holding the note for her in a language too low for ears and too honest for council minutes. The green mark under her skin pulsed once, then settled into a soft root-like light. Velka struck her staff against the hard ground. Enough. Initial growth does not satisfy trial conditions. The inspection moon remains the formal deadline. Ethan looked at the pale sky, where the inspection moon would not rise for weeks. You moved the inspection up because you thought we would fail early. Velka's mouth tightened. The council may adjust review schedules. Can it adjust reality too, or is that a separate department? A few people at the ridge laughed. Not loudly, but loud enough. Velka turned toward them, and the laughter thinned. Old fears still had roots. Soraya stood slowly. Dust clung to the hem of her coat. Let the trial continue, she said. Velka faced her. You are not in a position to demand terms. I am not demanding. Soraya looked across the dry field, toward the old irrigation ribs disappearing into red distance. I am inviting witnesses. That changed the air. Ethan felt it before he understood why. Velka did too. Her eyes narrowed. Explain. Soraya lifted her uncovered wrist, not high, not like a challenge, but like a lamp held where everyone could see it. If this field fails, let everyone see it fail. If it lives, let everyone see who was sent here and why. Let the workers test the soil. Let the children count the shoots. Let the families without land bring the seeds you marked for disposal. A murmur spread along the ridge line. Seeds. Land. Witnesses. 3 dangerous things when gathered in public. One of the assessors, the younger one with bronze freckles along his jaw, looked at his tablet and then at Velka. Matron, an open observational trial would strengthen the validity of the data. Velka gave him a look sharp enough to prune trees. The council does not require advice from junior soil staff. Ethan leaned toward Soraya. Junior soil staff just became my favorite title. Soraya did not smile, but the corner of her mouth considered it. Velka turned back to the crowd. This matter concerns council land. An older woman at the ridge, wearing the brown wrap of non-house labor, stepped forward with a child at her side. Her voice shook, but it carried. Dry fields are where you send those with no council standing. If we can be sent here, we can witness here. Ethan saw Soraya's eyes move to the woman, then soften in recognition. Not because they knew each other. Because they knew the sentence. Velka inhaled slowly. She had 2 choices, both bad. Refuse witnesses and confirm fear. Allow witnesses and lose the silence that had protected her. She chose the smaller wound. Observation only. No unauthorized planting. No interference with council assessment. Ethan lifted a hand. Define interference. You, Velka said. That feels personal. It is precise. The ridge crowd breathed easier, and that tiny release mattered. A trial with witnesses was still a trap, but traps changed shape when people watched the hinge. By afternoon, the dry fields had more visitors than they had seen in years. Not a festival. No banners. No music. Just people arriving with canteens, old gloves, broken tools, and pockets full of seeds too small, too cracked, too old, too unofficial. Ethan set up a work table beside the pump house and began sorting equipment. "No one plants yet," he called. "First we map moisture, test rows, clear mineral crust, and make sure nobody steps on the sprouts like a tragic metaphor." A child raised a hand. "What is a metaphor?" Ethan pointed at the pump. "That thing pretending to be functional." Soraya looked at him. "Your teaching style is strange. My students usually have wheels." She moved among the people with a quiet steadiness that made them listen. Not because she commanded them, but because she touched the soil before speaking. She showed them how to press 2 fingers into dust and feel whether it crumbled dead or held a faint coolness underneath. She asked their names. All of them. The old woman was Mara Pell. The child was Tuvin. The freckled assessor was Cale Oren. Names gathered around the field like water at a root. Ethan repaired 3 hand sprayers, unclogged a mineral screen, and rerouted the second irrigation rib, while former bystanders became helpers, one careful task at a time. Soraya did not sing until dusk. When she did, she asked them to stand back. The mark on her wrist brightened, but this time she did not kneel alone. Mara held a bowl of damp soil. Tuvin held the field recorder. Cale monitored the data. Ethan opened the valve exactly 1/4 turn. Soraya's voice moved low through the rows, not dramatic, not loud, but layered with the vibration of breath and memory. The soil answered in patches. Here a tremor. There a darkening line. Along the second row, 5 tiny shoots pushed up together, pale and trembling under the first stars. Nobody cheered. They were afraid to scare the green back into the ground. Then Tuvin whispered, "It knows her." Soraya lowered her hands, eyes shining with exhaustion. Ethan closed the valve and watched the pressure settle. Velka stood near her rover at the ridge, face unreadable in the fading light. She had not stopped them. That was not mercy. It was calculation. But it was also too late. The dry field was no longer an exile site. It had become a public question. That night, after the witnesses returned to the settlement with soil on their hands and things to tell, Ethan and Soraya sat outside the shelter under the faulty flood lamp. The field was still mostly red. The pump still wheezed. Their food still came from ration packets. Nothing was easy. But the first 2 rows held green. Soraya looked at the shoots for a long time. "I was afraid if they saw it, they would take it from me." Ethan leaned back against the pump house wall. "They might try. And if they do?" He looked at the field, at the witness markers, at the little white wires protecting sprouts, at the path where dozens of feet had stood without trampling anything. "Then they will have to take it from everyone who saw it live." Soraya turned to him. In her amber eyes, the old loneliness had not vanished. It had company now. That was different. Above them, the inspection moon rose thin and pale over the ridge, no longer a deadline in the distance, but a witness in the sky. By the second week, the dry fields had learned the sound of footsteps. Not the lonely kind that used to cross them when 1 or 2 reassigned workers arrived with dull tools and no hope. These were many footsteps, careful and uneven, coming at dawn and leaving after dusk, carrying canteens, seed packets, cracked hand sprayers, soil trays, and the fragile belief that a place could change after everyone in power had called it finished. Ethan Miller woke each morning before the settlement lights warmed the horizon and found people already waiting near the pump house. Mara Pell came with a notebook full of old planting songs her grandmother had half remembered. Tuvin brought stones to mark new shoots and took the job so seriously that he scolded adults for walking too close to row 3. Cale Oren, the junior assessor Velka had tried to dismiss, returned with portable soil sensors and the nervous courage of someone choosing data over career safety. Others came too. Non-house laborers. Greenhouse assistants. Clinic workers. A family that had lost its plot after a failed water vote. People who had spent years being told they were lucky to stand at the edge of someone else's harvest. Soraya then learned every name. Ethan noticed that. She never asked. "What house?" she asked. "What do you want to be called?" Sometimes the answer came quickly. Sometimes people looked startled, as if nobody had left them room to decide. The field grew around those answers. Not evenly. Not easily. Some rows stayed stubborn red no matter how long Soraya sang. Some seeds opened and then failed when the wind ran too hot. The pump still broke every other day in small irritating ways, and Ethan began speaking to it with the wounded patience of a man in a complicated friendship. But the green spread. It came in threads, patches, small stubborn clusters. It followed repaired water lines and Soraya's low songs. It gathered where children had marked the soil. It brightened under shade cloths stitched from old greenhouse scraps. By the 10th morning, the first section of the eastern dry fields looked less like a miracle and more like proof. That made it harder to dismiss. Matron Velka understood this better than anyone. She returned on the 11th day with the full council delegation, 3 senior agricultural assessors, and a recording drone that projected the council seal above the ridge like a cloud pretending to be law. Her dark green robes were practical this time, dust-sealed and plain, which meant she had dressed for credibility. Ethan distrusted that immediately. He stood beside the main pump, tightening the pressure clamp with a wrench while the witnesses gathered. Soraya stood in the center row wearing a work coat over her field wrap, sleeves rolled back, the green mark on her wrist uncovered in the morning light. It no longer looked like something exposed. It looked like something done hiding. Velka surveyed the field with a calm expression. "Sectional growth is acknowledged," she said. "However, the Council has identified concerns regarding land custody, biological contamination, unauthorized atmospheric capture, and potential long-term dependency on an unverified individual capacity." Ethan leaned toward Cale. "That is 5 fancy ways to say they hate being wrong." Cale whispered back. 6. "You missed custody." Velka's eyes flicked toward them. Ethan smiled politely. Soraya did not. She stepped forward until the first row of green lay between her and the council. "The data is public. Data requires interpretation," Velka said. "Yes," Soraya answered. "That is why everyone is here." The crowd along the ridge had doubled since the early inspection. People stood in lines between marker posts Ethan had set up to keep the soil from being trampled. Some carried tablets streaming live readings from the field recorder. Some held seed bags. Some simply watched with the intense stillness of those who had been denied hope so often they feared mishandling it. Velka lifted her staff. "The Council's position is simple. Even if your abilities are genuine, they do not alter land law. Dry fields remain under Council control. Any successful growth becomes colony resource under existing house distribution agreements." A long silence followed. There it was. Not the insult. Not the false science. The claim. The old system reaching for the first green thing the moment it rose. Ethan felt his hand tighten on the wrench. Soraya looked down at the chutes near her boots, then up at the ridge line where Mara stood with Tuvin. Her voice stayed calm. "Existing distribution agreements sent hungry families to watch house fields grow behind glass. Order requires allocation. Order required me to be unwanted." The sentence moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass that had not grown yet but might. Velka's face hardened. "Do not confuse personal grievance with agricultural governance." Soraya lifted her marked wrist. The green light pulsed once, and the nearest row answered with a faint shimmer across the leaves. "I am not speaking only for myself." She turned toward the ridge. "Mara Pell, what was your family classification?" The older woman stiffened at being named before the council, but she stepped forward. "Non-house labor. Seasonal. How many seasons?" 26. "Did your family request land access?" 4 times. "Result?" Mara's mouth tightened. "Deferred for water scarcity." Soraya looked to Cale. "And what does the public record show about water allocation during those years?" Cale swallowed, lifted his tablet, and projected the records from the field recorder's linked archive. House greenhouse reserves. Ornamental plots. Ceremony water. Waste from overpressurized luxury misting systems. The numbers appeared above the dry field in clean blue columns. Ethan saw the crowd read them. Saw recognition turn into something steadier than anger. Velka's voice sharpened. Those records are not under review. They are now, Soraya said. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just true enough to stand. Ethan stepped beside her and activated the repaired atmospheric mast. The tower projected its own log, dry field infrastructure disconnected after ration reforms, not due to technical impossibility, but by council order. He pointed to the line with the wrench. This was never dead land. It was unplugged land. The senior assessors murmured among themselves. One of them knelt, touched the damp soil, then looked at his instrument. The biological response is spreading beyond Section 1. Velka turned sharply. Contain it. The assessor hesitated. Matron, it is root network recovery. Containment would mean cutting viable growth. Then cut it from the record. The words left her mouth too cleanly. Too quickly. Everyone heard them. The drone recorded them. Tuvin, standing at the ridge with his marker stones, whispered. She said, cut the record. Children had a gift for making adult lies sound exactly as ugly as they were. The crowd shifted. Not forward in threat. Forward in attention. Velka realized the mistake and tried to smooth it. I meant revised preliminary interpretation. Ethan shook his head. No, you did not. Soraya looked at Velka for a long time. All the years were there between them. The greenhouse. The barren mark. The dry field sentence. The grandmother who never came back. The seed everyone called defective. You knew what I was, Soraya said. Velka did not answer. You knew my grandmother was a seed singer. Still nothing. The silence became confession by degrees. Soraya's voice remained quiet. You called us barren because you feared fields that could answer people without house permission. Velka finally spoke. I feared chaos. No, Soraya said. You feared food without ownership. That was the line that broke the last polite shape of the trial. Not into violence. Into decision. Mara stepped into the field path, then Cale, then the greenhouse assistants, then the non-house workers, each careful to stay between rows, each bringing forward their seed bags and records. Not a mob. A ledger of living witnesses. Ethan opened the main water valve 1/4 turn. The repaired mast hummed. The morning air thickened. Soraya stepped into the center of the first section and began to sing, not hidden, not alone, not pleading for permission. Her voice moved low through the soil, joined by Mara's grandmother rhythm, by the hum of the pump, by the wet click of irrigation ribs Ethan had dragged back from failure. The green mark on Soraya's wrist bloomed bright, and this time the field did not answer in one row. It answered across the basin. Small shoots rose in scattered lines far beyond Section 1, following old route maps that the council records had erased but the ground had remembered. People gasped. Some cried quietly. Tuvin laughed, a bright sound against the red wind. The first real cloud formed above the atmospheric mast, thin but growing, silver in the pale sky. Velka stood motionless as the dry field became harder to call dry with every passing second. Soraya lowered her voice, and the song settled into the soil. The rain began softly, falling on council robes, worker coats, seed bags, data tablets, and the stunned faces of people who had come expecting a trial and found a beginning. Ethan stood beside the pump controls, drenched and grinning, while water ran down his nose and into the dust. Soraya turned toward the crowd, rain shining on her gray-green skin and dark silver hair, the old false name barren washed from her without anyone needing to say it again. These fields will be common ground, she said. For those without houses. For those without claim. For those who were told nothing would grow where they stood. No one moved to stop her. The council could still argue. The houses could still delay. Velka could still dress fear in policy. But the field had answered in public, in rain, in green, in data, and in witnesses. Ethan looked at Soraya through the falling water and understood something simple enough to feel holy. He had picked her when nobody wanted her, not because he knew she could save the land, but because nobody deserved to be abandoned in front of a crowd. The land, it seemed, had agreed. By the next morning, the eastern dry fields no longer looked saved. That was the first honest thing about them. They looked wet, uneven, fragile, and alive in scattered places, like a patient breathing after years of being spoken of in the past tense. Red soil still stretched beyond the first basin. The wind still came hard from the ridge, dragging dust through the gaps in the repaired windbreaks. The pump still rattled like it had strong opinions about being useful. But green showed where green had no permission to be. Thin rows of shoots held their place beneath shade cloths stitched from greenhouse scraps. Tiny leaves trembled under droplets from the atmospheric mast. Around them, people moved with the careful urgency of those who had learned that beginnings could be broken by careless feet. Ethan Miller stood beside the pump house with both hands wrapped around a mug of burnt coffee, watching Mara Pell teach 3 children how to place marker stones without compressing the soil. His clothes were still damp from the rain. His hair had dried wrong. Mud clung to his boots and thick red plates. Every muscle in his back seemed to be filing its own complaint, but he did not move away from the pump because the machine had finally settled into a rhythm he trusted only if he could hear it. Soraya Van stood in the first row, speaking with the agricultural assessors while the green mark on her wrist glowed softly in the morning light. She had tied no cloth over it. Not anymore. Rain had washed the dust from her gray-green skin, and her dark hair, silver at the edges, was braided back with a strip of field cord. She no longer looked like the woman at the end of the ceremony line. She did not look like someone made powerful either. She looked like someone whose name had caught up to her body at last. Matron Velka Rowe remained near the council rover, watching the field with a stillness that had lost its authority and kept only its shape. The full council had stayed after the rain, because leaving would have looked like fear, and staying forced them to witness the problem their own language had created. By noon, the senior assessor delivered the report in front of everyone. Soil viability confirmed. Water capture restored. Dormant seed recovery active. Dry field designation under review. Common cultivation status recommended. The words were plain, technical, and devastating. Ethan loved them. Velka did not. Recommendation is not law, she said. The assessor lowered his tablet. No. But law without accurate conditions becomes obstruction. A murmur moved through the gathered workers. Velka's eyes flashed. Careful. Soraya stepped forward before the assessor could retreat into fear. No, she said. Let him be precise. The word precise mattered. It had once belonged to councils, classifications, labels like barren and non-viable. Now it stood in mud beside seedlings. Velka turned toward Soraya. You think a few sprouts make you fit to govern land? Soraya looked out over the basin. Mara was helping Tuvan label row 4. Kale was uploading public readings. Greenhouse assistants were unrolling old shade cloth. People without houses were planting the seeds they had brought from pockets and forgotten shelves. No, Soraya said. I think the land should not be governed by those who needed it dead. The silence after that was not empty. It was full of decisions forming. Velka lifted her staff, but no one stepped back. Ethan noticed that first. Fear still lived in the crowd, but it no longer knew where to stand. Soraya turned to the people at the ridge. The eastern fields will be open ground. Every family without house land may plant here. Every water reading will be public. Every seed distribution will be recorded by name, not by house rank. No one will be sent here as punishment again. A child whispered something to Mara, and Mara nodded with tears shining in her eyes. The council registrar looked to Velka for instruction. Velka gave none. He looked to the public data feed, then to the crowd, then began entering the order. Common Ground Charter, Eastern Basin. Temporary status pending colony vote. Witnesses present. Ethan sipped his terrible coffee and felt his throat tighten for reasons the coffee did not deserve. Later, when the first charter copy printed from the field recorder on cheap weatherproof paper, Soraya did not hold it up like a trophy. She carried it to the pump house wall and fastened it beside the old failure reports. The contrast was almost painful. Years of neat excuses. One muddy page of possibility. Ethan stood beside her while the wind tugged at the corners. "Looks official," he said. "It is temporary. Most good repairs start that way." She glanced at him. "Do humans always compare justice to broken machinery?" "Only the charming ones." She almost smiled. Then her gaze drifted to the greenhouse domes in the distance, yellow behind the red haze. "When I stood in that line, I thought the best I could hope for was to become invisible somewhere less cruel." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the pump house. "You were never very good at invisible." "No? You protected a seed with your dress while everyone was busy being awful. That was noticeable." Her eyes softened, but she looked down before the feeling could become too visible. Across the field, Velka stepped into her rover without ceremony. No one stopped her. No one bowed either. That seemed to wound her more than an argument would have. The rover drove back toward Ashfall Crossing, smaller with every yard, carrying the old order into a settlement that had already seen rain fall where it was forbidden. By evening, the dry fields glowed under a low amber sky. Rows were still thin, fragile, and full of work. The pump house lights flickered on. The repaired mast collected the first thread of night moisture. Families settled temporary tents along the ridge, not as exiles, but as planters. Ethan walked the perimeter with a wrench over one shoulder, checking lines, listening for pressure drops. Soraya walked beside him, touching the soil now and then, humming under her breath when a row felt too cold. At the original sprout, the one born from the discarded seed, she stopped. It had grown 2 more leaves. Nothing grand. Nothing a council would have noticed before it feared her. Ethan crouched beside it and adjusted the little white wire marker. "Stubborn thing." "It was unwanted," Soraya said. "That is not the same as dead." He looked up at her. In the fading light, the mark on her wrist glowed like a small green constellation. "No," he said. "It is not." She stood quietly for a while, listening to the field, the pump, the people, the wind. "Why did you choose me?" she asked at last. Ethan rested his arms on his knees. He could have said because she looked strong, because the room was cruel, because the dry fields were wrong, because one seed at her feet had been enough to indict them all. But the truth was simpler, and simple truths were the only ones worth saying after a day that large. "Because nobody wanted you," he said. "And I figured that said more about them than it ever said about you." Soraya closed her eyes. One tear slipped down, quiet and unashamed, then disappeared into the dust on her cheek. The field seemed to breathe around them. Not magically. Not perfectly. Just enough. Behind them, children laughed near the water drums. Mara called out row numbers. Cale argued with a censor. The pump rattled, caught, and steadied. Above Ashfall Crossing, the inspection moon rose pale over the ridge, no longer a deadline, no longer a threat. Just light on new leaves. Ethan and Soraya stood side by side in the common ground, not claimed, not discarded, not saved in any easy way. Chosen, perhaps. But more than that, choosing. And in the soil that everyone had called dead, the first green rows held their names.